Here's an interview for your listening, what we hope is pleasure. Dr. Lee Warren, he is a neurosurgeon, and he wrote a book called The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery.
Oh my goodness, what a wonderful interview. You did
Oh,
it.
good.
And
Oh,
yeah, you did
thanks.
it. And then
Huh.
I listened through it to,
Good
edit or
stuff.
whatever, but it was fantastic.
I like this guy.
Yeah. How'd you find out about the book? You just,
They sent something to me. It turns out, like, I didn't know, you'll find out in the interview, but he has already been reading my stuff. I
oh,
didn't
yeah,
know. I had
yeah,
no idea.
yeah.
It was like, oh, I've heard of him and liked his stuff. But it's the subtitle is Connecting Neuroscience and Faith to Radically Transform Your Life. It's good stuff. So, Dr. Lee Warren, here we go. I'm going to read your bio here. There's a lot here, but they condensed it very nicely. It says Dr. Lee Warren is a practicing neurosurgeon, trauma survivor, war veteran, and an award-winning writer. He offers evidence-based strategy for change in his new book, The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery, Connecting Neuroscience and Faith to Radically Transform Your Life. I did read this. I totally enjoyed it. Dr. Lee Warren, can you start with the story, the Russian dude in Antarctica? Because I thought that was great.
Yeah,
This is such a great story.
it is a great story, Brant, and it's good to be with you, by the way. Thank you
Thanks.
for giving me your time today. The story I opened the book with is 1961. The Soviets were sending an expedition to Antarctica, and on that trip was a young general surgeon named Leonid Rogozov. And Dr. Rogozov was the sort of team doctor for the expedition, if you will, the only doctor going with them. And they get to the Antarctic, and the ship that brought them there goes back to Russia, and it's winter time is going to set in, and before long, the ocean's frozen over, and there's no hope of anybody getting out of there or back in there until the spring comes. So these guys are there, there are 13 of them, and they're stuck there for several months. And then shortly after they got there, Dr. Rogozov got sick, and he began to have abdominal pain and running a fever, and he realized pretty quickly that he had appendicitis. And as you know, if you don't treat appendicitis, it's usually fatal.
Right.
And so he was in real trouble because he was there with a bunch of scientists and truck drivers and mechanics and people that didn't know how to take appendix out. He was the only one with any medical training. And he got in a lot of mental fog. He's got this great diary that the family preserved, and you can read it online. And he goes into this mental fog, and he's despairing, and he's not going to see his family again, and he's hopeless, and he's really worried. And then he has this incredible perspective shift where he basically can get outside of the trouble for a second and say, wait a minute, I'm not just dying of appendicitis. I'm not just suffering and waiting for a doctor. I'm also a doctor. Like I also know how to treat people who have appendicitis. And so he had this incredible shift in his mind of I'm not a patient. I'm also a surgeon, and I can if I could just figure out a way to work this problem from a different perspective, I might survive it. So he trained a mechanic to hold a mirror for him so he could see his hands and his abdomen. And he trained another guy to slap him if he passed out from the pain. And he took his own appendix out, and he saved his own life. And I just tell that story to say that before Rogozov could take his own appendix out, he had to stop seeing himself as just one thing. He wasn't just the patient, he was also a surgeon who knew what to do and had the compassion and skill and availability to solve the problem. So it was a fascinating story.
That's a big switch mentally. Like you're asking people to make this switch, to see themselves not just as a passive patient, but as somebody who's actually administering mercy to the patient, like
That's right.
and helping the patient. So talk to me about that metaphor, because that's obviously an eye-grabbing thing. It's a great title, talking about doing your own brain surgery to yourself. Like, how is that a great metaphor? And yeah, just talk to me about the metaphor itself.
Yeah, so it turns out, interestingly, to be a really great and fascinating metaphor, but also, as I studied it and learned more about it, not a metaphor at all. So I'll break down the first part of it is that we all think that we've been pretty much conditioned by our society and our schooling and everything to think that we're sort of just the product of the way that our brains work. So, like the genetics you got, the family you were raised in, the traumas you've been through, all the stuff you've been through in your life sort of crafts the brain that you have. And if everything about you is because of your brain, your potential, your hopes, your dreams, your fears, your phobias, all that stuff is just about brain activity, then you're really sort of stuck trying to figure out how to manage your life with the brain that you have. And you've written a lot about neurodivergence, for example. You have some things about you that are the product of the way your brain works. And all of us have been taught that our anxieties and our fears and everything about us is fixed in us because of how our brains work. And so 21st century neuroscience comes along and starts doing what's called functional imaging, which is where you can put somebody in a brain scanner and not just take a picture of their brain, but see what the brain is doing when it's thinking something or when the patient's moving or something. And you can actually see what's happening to blood flow in different parts of the brain, which is kind of a proxy for what neurotransmitters are being produced and what regions of the brain are being activated. And you can see that the way people think changes what their brain does. And so you can then start to see, wow, if I think one thing and not another thing, it changes what my brain does. It's not that your brain is doing something that makes you think something. It's actually that your thoughts control what your brain does. And so I'll make this more personal. We lost a son in 2013. Our son Mitch was stabbed to death. And I was a practicing neurosurgeon in a town called Auburn, Alabama, which is home of Auburn University. And our office was on the third floor of a research center at Auburn where they do this functional MRI research. And so shortly after Mitch died, about a month after he died, my wife ran our practice at the time. So Lisa and I worked together in the practice. And we had gone back to work because we had to, not because we felt like it, but because we had to. It was time to go back to work. And we got invited to go down and watch this research happen where they were doing this MRI functional research. And they put this woman in the scanner, Brant, and they had headphones on her so they could communicate with her. And they said, Mrs. Johnson, think about the worst thing you've ever felt in your life, like the hardest moment you've ever been through. And so you saw her kind of wrinkle her brow up and think of something. And then shortly after that, the colors on the screen began to change as different parts of her brain got activated. And as a neurosurgeon, I could tell what was happening. I could see the amygdala and hippocampus, the parts of her brain that are related to fear and anxiety and things like that, began to light up and get really active. And then shortly after that, her physiology began to change. Her blood pressure went up and her heart rate went up and her breathing changed. And I could see her move from thinking something to brain doing something to her body reacting to that thought. And then a second later, they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson, stop thinking about that hard thing and now think about the best thing you can ever remember, your favorite day of your life, whatever that was. And you saw her again sort of curl up her brow and think, and then her brain began to light up in the frontal lobes and the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, all the parts that are related to processing happy memories and executive functioning and all these good things. And then her body began to change and her heart rate came down, her blood pressure came down, and she calmed down. In real time, we saw this happen. And it was just this real clear progression from thought to brain activity to body activity. And my wife had this insight. Our wives are always ahead of us, right?
Right,
But
right.
my wife had this thought. She said, that reminds me of Philippians 4. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, it says, don't be anxious for anything, but be grateful. And then the peace of God will guard your heart and think different stuff. Think about things that are lovely and beautiful and all that. And you won't be as anxious. And I was like, wow, that's exactly what we're seeing here in front of us. We're seeing different thoughts producing different brain activity, producing different body activity. And I'm not a charismatic guy by any means. I'm a pretty conservative Christian. So I try to be really careful saying things like God spoke to me or I heard God say something because I don't have that experience very often. But in that moment, in my bereaved state after having just lost my son and being beaten up by my brain and all my automatic negative thinking and the way I was feeling hopeless and desperate and doubting my faith and all that stuff. And then as a neurosurgeon watching this research happen, something happened inside of me, Brant, really in real time. And I had this really clear experience of understanding that when I go to the operating room and I perform brain surgery on somebody, what I'm doing is I'm intentionally making a structural change in their brain for the purpose of improving their life in some way. And when that woman changed from thinking about something hard to thinking about something happy, she was intentionally making a structural change in her brain that for the purpose of making her life better in some way. So she was improving her life by changing the content of her thoughts, which is exactly what Philippians 4 said. And it just meshed right then that self brain surgery is this ability that God has given us to direct our thinking in a way that will take command of processes he built into our brains that will then result in our lives playing out in a different way and not being as trapped by the reactive nature of our thinking. And it came together. This self brain surgery is not a metaphor at all. It
No,
turns
you're
out to
right.
be
You're right. You're
what's
right.
actually happening.
It's affecting you physically. This isn't just an
Yeah.
idea. So I was thinking a while back. I don't know if you read this book. I wrote about anxiety in a book called "Life is Hard, God is Good, Let's Dance." But
Love that book.
Oh, did you read it? Okay, thanks. Or listen to it or something.
Yeah, listen to it.
Well, that's I thought about that with regard to like praising God. Like praising God, like when I was a kid or even as an adult, like why does he need to be praised all the time? Like is he an egoist and like he just needs us to say you're awesome, you're amazing. And then I've realized it's for us
That's right.
because you're repeating these things and putting your mind on these things that are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Like when you praise God, you're reminding yourself of his faithfulness. Like you're doing that to your brain.
That's right.
So he's
It's
actually
it's
he's giving us instructions, just like in Philippians, like you said, like he's giving us instructions about how to actually do this.
That's right. Pretty much everything. Now that it's just one of those things, that Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, where if you see like a yellow Ferrari,
Yes.
you notice it once,
Start
then all of a
noticing
sudden you
it.
see them
Yeah.
everywhere, right? Once you start looking at Scripture through the lens of seeing how God's instructions are always about our flourishing in our lives, all of them
Yes.
are. How do people best flourish in their lives? And everything he says is designed to help us have a more abundant life, which is interesting because Jesus said in John 10:10 that he came here so that we could have abundant lives, right? He could have saved us in some other way, but he came here to give us abundance in our life. So, and abundance doesn't mean freedom from hard circumstances, it means the ability to flourish in spite of them. And
Yeah.
so, if you think about that, then you look at something like worship in the context of 21st century brain imaging research. And there's some fascinating studies that have been done from a guy named Andrew Newberg at Penn. His group has been the leader in this, and they've shown that awe and worship and mindful prayer actually increases the size, the physical size of the hippocampus of your brain by about 22% if you practice that for a few minutes a day for as little as 6 weeks. So that means that practicing mindfulness, worship, meditative prayer, that kind of thing, that awe and wonder thing that God tells us to do, it actually increases the size of the part of your brain that's involved in your ability to be emotionally resilient
Makes full
and
sense.
more hopeful. So it's fascinating.
And I feel like the culture does the opposite. Like it beats us out. Like it's almost like let's see if we can shrink that hippocampus.
That's right.
Let's keep you in a place where you just think you're a machine.
Yeah.
And so as a I'm curious about that. Like as a neurosurgeon who's a believer, and I know a few, so I'm always interested in talking to them about this, but people do think that you are your brain, like your brain is your mind.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting because I was a Christian who then went to brain surgery school, right? So I was doing neurosurgery training and neuroscience research and all that for years. And the doctrine, and I say doctrine intentionally because every worldview is its own religion, right? So
Right.
the traditional neuroscientist dogma and doctrine is that everything about you is the product of brain activity.
Uh-huh.
Even your idea that you have a self, that some neuroscientists would say that just that idea is just the epiphenomenon of brain activity. It's just it's an illusion that you even have a free will or a mind or that you're thinking about anything. It's all just neuronal activity. And those folks that are really truly materialist neuroscientists would say that there's not even any such thing as consciousness or mind. It's all just brain generated activity. And if that were the case, then the idea of even having free will or any hope or meaning or purpose of your life would be zero. Like there's just all about you keep firing until your last neuron dies off and then you're gone, right? But interestingly, there's been good evidence from neurosurgery all along, believe it or not, as godlike as most neurosurgeons like to think they are. There's a guy named Wilder Penfield. I don't know if you ever heard of Dr.
Uh-uh.
Penfield, but he died in the 80s. His work was primarily in the 60s and 70s, and he's from Montreal. And he has the world's largest series of awake brain surgeries because he was interested in seizures. And so, if you want to do seizure surgery, you have people awake and you stimulate their brain and try to trigger their seizures or try to suppress different things. And he did all this mapping of what parts of the brain do what thing. In fact, if you've ever seen that picture of the little person on the brain surface and have you seen that? Like, it's called the homunculus, and it's like a depiction of what parts of your brain do what
Yeah, yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that famous drawing that came from Dr.
That's
Penfield's
him. Okay,
awake.
okay.
So he's the guy that generated that. But he had this experience where he did all these awake brain surgeries, and he would stimulate somebody's motor cortex and make them unable to move their arm, for example. And he would say, "Okay, move your arm," and they would move it, and he would put the electrode on the brain and say, "Now move your arm," and they couldn't because he was overriding that part of the brain. But after those surgeries, when he would talk to those patients, he would say, "What were you thinking about when I was stimulating that part of your brain?" And they would say, "Oh, I could tell when you were making me move something or making me unable to move it. And I was thinking about wanting to move it or not wanting to move it. And I could tell a difference between what I was thinking and what my brain was doing." Like they perceived that difference. They
Very
could
interesting.
feel it. It's fascinating. And so
Yeah.
Penfield, because of that research, he wrote a little bitty book. It's on my shelf back there called The Mystery of the Mind. And he started that book or his research as a committed materialist, and he finished it as a believing person who believes that the mind and the brain are not the same thing. And he basically reformed himself religiously because of his experience of doing brain surgery on those people. And another interesting thing that Dr. Penfield figured out is that when people have seizures, they sometimes sort of remember things and they sometimes sort of think things during seizures, but they never think anything abstract. Like they never have a seizure that makes them think about chess moves or Beethoven music. It's always chaotic, unstructured, sort of weird things that brains might be able to generate, but it's never abstract thinking. And his perspective on that was that abstract thinking requires an immaterial mind that's separate from brain. And so that started this process of people starting to talk openly about the idea that mind and brain might not actually be the same thing, which is what scripture said all along, right? A
Absolutely.
long time ago.
Right.
But then now we can put you in a functional MRI scanner and we can sort of image that in real time and see it. And so my thoughts are that although the traditional neuroscience thinking is still pretty dogmatic about this, anybody that's willing to honestly look at the current evidence is having a really hard time believing that mind and brain are the same thing.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So walk me through like there's a lot of conditions that we have in your book that you discuss. Like, but let's just talk about anxiety.
Yeah.
Like walk me through like what self-brain surgery looks like when it comes to anxiety and how someone could think about this.
The most important thing that I'll tell you there before we get into specifically anxiety is that there's really good research to indicate that a huge percentage of the things that automatically pop into our heads that sound like our own thoughts and the things that we feel from moment to moment, a huge percentage of them are false. They're just brain generated things that are basically your brain is kind of a sensor looking out into the environment, trying to sense what's happening and give you a story to sort of contextualize what you're experiencing or might be experiencing. But we know now that the human brain doesn't have any sort of mechanism to discern between something that's actually happening and something that you're just worrying about or ruminating on. And
Hmm.
so that's important when we start talking about anxiety, because if you understand that everything you feel is the product of chemical activity in your brain, that neurotransmitters are what generates the physiologic responses that you have to make you feel anxiety or fear or excitement or whatever. And then if you understand that there's only a handful of these chemicals that create the entire palette of your potential emotional feelings,
Hmm.
if you understand those two things, then you can understand why a story like the one I tell in the book that I'm about to tell you is true. Let's say you go to the mailbox and you open the mailbox up and you pull a letter out and it says IRS, Internal Revenue Service on it. Like most people will have some sort of reaction to seeing a letter from the IRS. And it might be that you feel your heart rate go up and you feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up and your mouth gets dry and your heart starts to race and you're afraid. You're scared you're going to get audited, or you forgot to check some box and you're going to get a big fine, or something happened and your accountant lost your tax return. You're going to go to jail because you didn't file a tax return. Something you're afraid of something, right? But some people might get that letter and they might look at it and they might feel their heart rate go up and they might feel their hair on the back of their neck stand up. They might feel their mouth get dry. And it might be because they're anticipating the refund that they've been looking forward to because they need to make their house payment. They're worried about the mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
right? But notice that in those two situations, the physiology is the same.
Right.
Your heart rate's going up, blood pressure's going up, mouth's getting dry, all that stuff. What makes one anxiety and one excitement is the story that you're telling yourself
Right.
about what you're feeling,
Right.
right? So it's all contextual, but you're feeling the same thing. So when you say, well, I trust my feelings, well, you shouldn't trust your feelings because they're just telling you some information and you're making a story up based on some prior experience or your current emotional state or something like that to decide what those feelings mean. So once you know that, then self-brain surgery becomes really helpful because you can say, okay, I'm aware now that a lot of the things that I feel are never true. They're just based on something that I'm worrying about or some current state that I'm in or something that's happened in the past. And since I know that, if I can start to be curious about what I'm feeling, if I can say, wait, I feel something that means that it usually means that I'm anxious,
Uh-huh.
but I don't have to give into that and have a panic attack or become anxious over it or stop or not go to the place or not do the thing. Instead, I can get curious about it. I can start to ask questions about it. I can get my frontal lobes engaged instead of my amygdala. And I can say, what is it that I'm feeling and why am I feeling that? And is there actually anything going on? Is there really something dangerous here? And then you can start to question what you feel and think instead of reacting to what you feel and think. And that's going to get your brain to start making better connections and automating better responses. And before you know it, you'll have a habit of becoming curious about things instead of reactive to them. That's what the Bible talks about in 2 Corinthians 10:5 when it says, take every thought captive. It's
Yes.
basically saying, don't believe everything you think and feel.
Right.
Check it out first. Decide what it means. Decide if it deserves a response or not. And if it's not true, you don't need to respond to it, right? We shouldn't spend any time of our lives reacting to things that were never true in the
No,
first place.
not at all. So I want to not knock you off track. I just want to echo that. Like David practices this in Psalms, right? Why are you so
Absolutely.
downcast, oh my soul? Put your trust
That's
in
right.
God. He's talking to himself.
That's right.
Eh,
I wrote a book called Hope is the First Dose. And that was after our son died. I wrote that book about
mhm.
how to try to find your way forward. And I read Psalm 77 and Ecclesiastes 3 and Psalm 143. All are three different people who do exactly what you just described. They feel something and they start to panic or they start to get really depressed or they start to get really moribund about it. And then they remind themselves of something that's truer than that. The guy in Lamentations is like, I'm
Limitations, exactly. Yep.
right. It's like I'm
Yeah.
hopeless. I'm desperate. My teeth are broken. God hates me. I'm of all the
Yes.
people in the world, I'm the one that's got the worst. Right. And then he says, but this one thing I do, I call hope to mind.
Minds. Yeah, I
Right.
call it to
And he
mind.
goes and he preaches to himself. And then David says, preach to my soul. Why are you so downcast? All that stuff. Asaph does the same thing in Psalm 77. He's like, wait, you're the God who built a highway through the desert, through the ocean that nobody knew was there. Like you can do stuff that can get me out of this. So I defined hope as this sort of memory that God's done stuff before, and then this movement towards that truth. And in this context, in the new book, it's like you've got to get into that place where you don't trust your feelings and your thoughts automatically. You check them out first because it's a profoundly biblical thing to do, and it's a profoundly helpful thing neuroscientifically to do.
Man, and so again, back to the overarching metaphor, which is more than a metaphor, as you say. It's true, and it's more than a metaphor. It's better than the Antarctica story, honestly, because nobody can do this for you.
That's right.
Like, well, he realized that in that situation because out of an emergency, it's strange. It was an odd situation, but for all of us, no one else but you can is going to purposefully remind you in that moment. Like it has to be yourself. There's not going to be another surgeon, another person cannot constantly be speaking into your conscience like this, right? So
That's
this
right.
is why this is such an important life skill. How would
Mhm.
people like the book isn't for kids, but it seems like this is a life skill that kids should be taught. I wonder if there's a way to do that thoughtfully. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I wrote it. There's a chapter in the back of the book called Pediatric Self Brain Surgery. And it's for parents and caregivers and therapists and people who are taking care of little kids. And I think there's some really good research now that almost the worst thing you can do, which is something we've all been doing, or many of us have been doing for a generation now, is almost the worst thing you can do is send your kid preventively to a therapist to talk about their feelings. Like, it turns out to be like the worst thing you can do because if you say, hey, tell me what you're feeling, if you say, hey, what are you feeling, let's talk about your feelings, what happens is, and it happens in the brain very powerfully, is whatever you are feeling, when you start to talk about it and investigate it and sit with it and spend time with it, it gets bigger, it gets
Yes,
more powerful. And
right.
so if you're anxious and you go sit with somebody to talk about how anxious you are, you get more anxious. And so the therapy needs to be aimed at at let's take what you're feeling and let's think about what you want to feel and what you need to feel or what would be more helpful and productive in your life to feel, and let's build a path towards that rather than amplifying and thinking about what it is that you do feel. So I think the number one thing for kids here would be not to ignore things that our kids are feeling, not to do that. We need to be honest about what we're feeling, but to just gently teach them that the way to feel better is to begin to pivot towards something healthier that they want to feel. Because your brain, it turns out, doesn't care if what you're telling it is true or not.
Right.
It doesn't care. It just wants to automate things to make it easier and less mentally taxing for you to keep doing that thing. So the way the brain works is if you say to yourself, this is going to be a terrible day. I'm going to have the worst day ever because I overslept my alarm. You say something like that to yourself. The reticular activating system of your brain, which is this incredible network of neurons in your brainstem, it sort of acts like a filter and it listens for mental commands to say, okay, you just told me that it's going to be a lousy day. So I'm going to start showing you all the evidence that it's going to be a bad day. And you literally won't see evidence to the contrary. Like, and that all of us have had that experience, right?
Yes. Right.
You feel like it's going to be a bad day. Everything you see is terrible that day. And I knew it. I knew this was going to turn out this way today. But conversely, your brain also will say, if you say, I'm going to have a good day, even though something might be hard, I'm going to have a good day, you'll start seeing evidence of a good day all around you. Sunrises, rainbows, your kid drawing you a picture as you're going by, like all these things will happen. And the thing to know is that both of those things, the day contained all of that stuff
Yeah.
in both cases. You just only saw what you were looking for.
Right.
And so for kids, they need to be shown and taught that not everything they think and feel is true,
Right.
and that they will be more productive and have a happier life if they learn to take what they're feeling and investigate it and be curious about it before they believe it and react to it.
Yes. That is so good. In the brain, once you've made that distinction between my brain is not me. There's this physical thing and it's wonderful
Yeah,
and complex beyond our understanding, but it's not me. But once you make that, you can separate yourself from all this data that but your brain's constantly, like you said, trying to make shortcuts
that's
constantly
right.
to understand the world. It'll simplify things into basic narratives that aren't true and just go with what you wanted. Gosh, that's so good. I was thinking about anger too, when you talked about making things bigger, because all the data has shown when people say they can vent and it helps, they think it helps, but actually the data shows it doesn't help at all, but it
It
makes it
doesn't.
it makes it bigger. Like,
That's
but
right.
it makes sense given what you're talking about if you stop down on this. This is great. I'm really thankful for this book and I'm thankful for what you do.
Thank you.
It's all very interesting. And especially given your personal experience in addition to professional experience. I- How do you feel about the book you wrote, the Hope is the First Dose? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
How do you feel about that now when looking back on it?
I love that book because so going back one book before that, and my previous book prior to that was about brain tumors and how I was working as a neurosurgeon to try to help people hold on to hope when they're going through hard stuff. And Mitch died while I was writing that book. Our
Oh,
son, Mitch, died. And I became one of those people that was suffering. And so that book sort of ended with this, you know, we survived it. We're going forward. We found our feet again. Sort of ended with this sort of description of how we made it through. And I always felt like I needed to give people my prescription. Like, what did we actually do that helped? Like when you lose a child, when you go through something hard like that, what's going to help? And so Hope is the First Dose was sort of my treatment plan for how people can navigate hard things and hold on to faith and all that. And then I realized like I had this curse of being a storyteller, and so I tend to write memoir, right?
yeah, yeah,
So I wrote memoir, but I didn't really give a true sort of self-help but not self-reliance package of what the neuroscience says. And so this book doesn't supersede Hope is the First Dose. It just sort of evolves naturally out of it, and it's much more scientific and practical, I think.
because of your job and who you are, did you find yourself like spectating on your own grief, like C.S. Lewis or like,
Definitely.
yeah, I mean, what was that like? Do you feel like you processed it any differently than anybody else or
I, I don't know. I mean,
harder?
I do know that I had this recurring it was a sort of a daydream. It was sort of like a waking nightmare where I would see this mental image of like this staircase that went down, and I would feel myself being kind of pulled toward it, like I didn't have any power to stop myself from going in. And I was awake and I was aware that I was basically getting ready to descend into that grief thing. And the vision was always that so our son Mitch was stabbed to death, right? And I wasn't there. It happened in another city. And I had this incredible vision of this door at the bottom of this staircase, and I knew Mitch was behind that door somehow, and I knew he was bleeding out.
Mm,
And if I could just get to him, I could save him.
mm,
And I would have that sensation and that cognitive awareness that I was having it,
mm,
and I couldn't stop myself from still descending into it. And every time I did, it was this despair loop of I wasn't there. I could have helped him. And I'm a doctor. I know how to stop bleed. All these things that I thought he was stabbed in the neck, and I was just like I could have saved him, even though that was irrational, and all that. And so I found myself at the same time I was experiencing that, thinking about experiencing it and saying, "Oh, I know what's happening in my brain when this is happening." And it was all this stuff, but I still couldn't stop myself from having it. It was this most bizarre thing. So I looked at it as a scientist, and I felt it as a grieving dad at the same time.
What would you tell yourself now about that if somebody said, I'm having this recurring thing? Like,
I'd say don't forget that grief is a process that you're supposed to go through, first of
mhm,
all. So don't beat yourself up for having that stuff happen, because you're supposed to go through that. If you don't, you're going to get stuck and it's going to come out in PTSD or something later,
mhm.
as I did after my time in the Iraq War. Um, so don't beat yourself up for experiencing a normal human phenomenon that God gave you for the purpose of helping you to heal. So do that. But also don't choose to descend into it when that's not productive or helpful to you, because you do have some agency and choice there. So I recognized over time that if I'm in the operating room, that's not the time to let myself go down the staircase, right? I've got to be there for my patient. Or if I'm in a meeting that's with my CEO and it's important, that's not the time to give into that grieving moment. So I began to understand that I had agency. I could choose
Mhm.
when I engaged in that process and when I didn't. And over time, it became less and less necessary for that to happen as I healed and grew. And so I think I would just say, be patient with yourself, be kind with yourself, but also recognize that you don't have to be a victim of it. Like you can choose to stay in that metacognitive space where you're thinking about it, but you don't have to experience it right then.
Yeah, boy, that's widely applicable for a lot of things. It's a great book. I totally enjoyed it. It's The Life-Changing Art of Brain Surgery, Connecting Neuroscience and Faith to Radically Transform Your Life. Uh, have you read do you know what Ian McGilchrist is by any chance?
Oh yeah, he's going to be on my podcast next month. I love him.
What? Really?
Yeah, I got him. I had to wait a year, but he's coming.
So have you read The Matter with Things?
I'm working through the matter of things. It's like 7,000 pages long. So it's,
80,000 pages. And
yeah.
then and then there's volume two that's on my shelf, which is another
Yeah.
$4,000.
I think there's 600 pages of notes and references at the end of that. But seriously, like it's ridiculous. But so I'm trying to read 10 pages a day. The Master and His Emissary, his first book was only about 700 pages long. So
Yeah,
that,
that's a breeze. That's a primer. So, but once I've read this, my son's been through both of them. My son's a med student at Yale now, and
wow.
wants to be a neurosurgeon, but he may do something else. I don't know what he's going to do. But the idea of left hemisphere capture, I see it everywhere now.
Yeah.
And even reading your book, there's things that it's like, yeah, there it is again. Like the inability to see the big picture, the
Yeah.
gestalt, as he talks about, like which God is called when he calls us back to the stars in the sky.
Yeah.
This is good for us.
That's
To
right.
think about the big picture, the cosmos itself. God so loved everything that He made that He's so. I had to ask you that because there's a lot of interplay going on, and
Yeah.
I cannot wait to hear you interview him. I didn't even have the temerity to ask for an interview with that guy, so that's
I'll
gonna be
send it to you when I do it. I requested an interview with him over a year ago, and his assistant was great. She said, "Yeah, how's April 2026?" I was like, "Okay, put it down."
that's great. Well, thanks so much, man. I look forward to being on your podcast too. Now I get to reverse the role there, but
It's going to be a great talk, Brant.
yeah.
I value your work. Your book, Unoffendable, remains one of my go-to resources. I've given it, I've told people about it for years, and it's
Thank
just
you.
it's an honor to talk to you today.
Well, thanks a lot. I feel like we're doing the same thing from different angles. I'm just a radio guy, but it's like you're putting a different spin on the same message in many ways. So I love it.
You too,
So,
brother.
well, that was that interview. Again, thanks to Dr. Lee Warren. The book, if you want to find it, is called The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery, and you can find it on Amazon and all the usual book places.
I think this is specifically a podcast you could share with a lot of people, because when I was listening to it, I was thinking
Interesting.
there were a lot of people that I would share it with who are believers, but they approach it from a really kind of logical and scientific mindset, and
Yeah.
that they would be really impacted by.
Yeah.
So if you know people like that, I think this is a good one to share.
Cool.